All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. It is such an incredible source to be able to continue the daf with all of you today. Begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our TALMUD sponsors for the month of Iyar, to thank Yona Shushie Ehrenfeld for dedicating the shiurim this week in memory of Yona's grandfather, Yosef ben Shmuel Aron, to thank Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Netanya for dedicating the shiurim this month in memory of Dr. Michael Gelfand, Moshe Chaim, ben Tzvi Hirsch. Our week of learning sponsors, Hillel Loni Goldman in honor of Dr. and Mrs. Jacob and Goldie Milner and the entire Kehila. Ari and Haley Lichterman in memory of Haley's mother, Rachel Leah Bas Ruvain Meir. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Hillel Soclof in memory of his mother, Chaya Bracha Bas Tzvi Hirsch Halevi, and my mishpacha in honor of my grandmother's yahrzeit, Malka Bas Akiva. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families in the chum. Of course, we also take the opportunity to dedicate the daf today, really in honor of Yom Ha'atzmaut. You know, as I mentioned in the message that I recorded for Yom Ha'atzmaut. You know, people observe this particular day in many different ways from a halachic perspective. Halal, no halal, bracha, yes bracha, all different ways. But however a person celebrates it, the most important thing to recognize is a profound sense of hakaras hatov. That Baruch Hashem, we have the ability to have a homeland, that we have an ability to travel freely to that homeland, that we have an ability to learn in that homeland, to work in that homeland, whatever it is, that Baruch Hashem, a Jew in today's day and age, all they have to do is purchase a plane ticket, and a person has the ability to step foot on the holy soil of Eretz Yisrael, and that in and of itself, ein zechus gidola mizo. There is no greater benefit and no greater merit. So however we express our gratitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on this day, the most important thing is that we find a way to express the gratitude. And I will say with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Nun Tes 59. Actually, a really riveting Gemara ahead of us today. A really riveting Gemara. So we're picking up the last line, 59. We're picking up the last line on Nun Ches Amud Beis 58b. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, Nis Amalu Onis Garshu. So remember again, the Mishnah, the Gemara was making reference to the Mishnah that we had on Nun Vav Amud Beis. So remember, the Sugi there is dealing with a Kohen who has married a woman who he is not permitted to marry. So again, you know, we went with the extreme case of the Kohen Gadol who was marrying the Almana. So remember again, the Mishnah was primarily focused on what happens halacha l'maisa after an illegal kiddushin. Does a legal kiddushin, by definition, from the beginning, preclude her from going ahead and consuming truma? The Mishnah then went on to say that even if you say that from kiddushin and on, she's not permitted to go ahead and eat truma, halacha l'maisa, she only becomes disqualified after nisuin. That was lashon of the Mishnah. Nis'amalu o nisgarshu min hanisuin psulos min ha'erusin ksheros. So for example, remember again, once a woman is in an illegal marriage, she becomes a halala, right? She becomes ultimately someone who's precluded from marrying future kohanim. When does that status devolve upon her? Only after nisuin, not during erusin. Not during erusin. Okay, so it says the Gemara. So let's go back. So Nun Chesam Beis, last two lines. Interesting case. So Rabbi Chia bar Yosef asked the following shaila from Shmuel. Kohen Gadol shekidish esakitana ubagra tachtov. So we'll say a little bit of background for this, and then the truth is this is gonna be the next Mishnah. A girl has 3 stages in her maturation. Below the age of 12, she's called a kitana. From the age of 12 to 12 and 6 months, she's called a nara, and from the age of 12 years and 6 months and on, she's a gedola, an adult. Now we are going to see something very interesting, which is that a Kohen Gadol is obligated to marry a besula. He's obligated to marry a virgin. That's an additional thing above and beyond a regular Kohen. He has to marry a besula. Interestingly enough, what the Gemara understands is as follows. As a woman gets older and becomes, or as a girl gets older, becomes more active, very often the besulim, the hymen itself, could become thinner. So there's a discussion about a Kohen Gadol. Is he allowed to marry a Bogeres? Now remember, a Bogeres is a woman who is 12 years old and 6 months and above, right? And is a Besula in that she's never had relations with anyone. But there is a strong possibility that the Besulim, just physiologically, the Besulim themselves have thinned out a bit. So ultimately, again, is he permitted to marry such a woman? So the Gemara says, see, here we go. So Kohen Gadol shekiddush sakitana ubagra tachtav. So let's say, again, the Gemara now is presupposing that a Kohen Gadol shouldn't marry a Bogeres. Like I said, that's going to be the topic of the next Mishnah. Presupposing a Kohen Gadol shouldn't marry a Bogeres. Okay, so let's say he did. Let's say he went ahead. Actually, the case over here is as follows. He did kiddushin with a kitana, and then goes ahead and obviously before Nisuin, she becomes a Bogeres. If you look at Rashi, last Rashi on Chesam Beis, Rashi says over here, Bimei irisin v'kohen gadol asher b'Bogeres, kidarmina b'mas nisan umitzaso b'tana b'nara. So what happened? So Kohen Gadol goes ahead and does erisin with a kitana, but ultimately again she becomes a bogeres before he does nisuin. What's the halacha? So it says Gemara Mahu. So the Gemara says basar nisuin azlinan, top of Montes, basar nisuin azlinan, or basar erisin azlinan. Well, this is very interesting shaila. Do we judge the validity of the Kohen Gadol's marriage by erisin or by nisuin? It's the fundamental shaila, by erisin or by nisuin. So it says the Gemara. So remember again, think about this just a moment. If you judge it, if you go basar erisin, in other words, remember again, he did erisin with a girl who is a nara, let's call it a nara. Therefore, that's totally permitted, right? Even though she becomes a bogeres before nisuin, at the end of the day, the marriage should still be absolutely fine. However, if you go basar nisuin, then by the time you get to nisuin, she is a bogeres, and that could be problematic. To which the Gemara says, I'm late to nisuin. So the answer, the truth we learned in the Mishnah. What did we learn in the Mishnah? So nisarmalu o nisgarshu. So remember again, the Mishnah said, Kohen Gadol married an almana. So what happens if she was widowed or they divorced? Min hanisuin psulos. If ultimately, again, she was widowed or divorced from nisuin, she becomes a chalala and she cannot marry another Kohen. Mina erisin ksheros. But ultimately, again, from erisin, if she's widowed or divorced, ultimately she remains ksheros, she remains kosher. Now look at Rashi. What do you see from here? Mina erisin ksheros, amma bipsul kahuna basar nisuin azlinon midlo pasul amana shenes arzal kohen gadol meis. So what do you see from here? You see from here clearly that halacha lamaisa, when it comes to psul, we go ahead and we go after erisin and not after nisuin. That becomes clear. So again, look at Rashi once more. Amma b'psul kahuna, when it comes to a psul for kahuna purposes, basar nisuin aslinan, we go after nisuin. And again, the proof to that is what? The proof to that is the fact that halacha l'maisa, when the Kohen Gadol marries the almana, if they get divorced from erisin, she is fine. She's permitted to marry another Kohen. From nisuin is when there's a problem. So therefore, you see that halacha l'maisa, in this marriage, the status is determined by nisuin and not by erisin. And Abosai, so therefore, again, going back to our previous question, we would assume that therefore, if you assume, and again, we haven't got, this is our next sugya, but assuming that a Kohen Gadol has to marry a nara. So if he marries a nara, does erisin with a nara, but then she becomes a bogeres before nisuin, that would seem to be okay. So the Gemara says, we go after, I'm sorry, that would not be okay, because we go after nisuin. To which the Gemara says, Amarle, the shavi chalala lo kami boili. I'm not asking when she becomes a chalala. The Gemara says, the biyahi demashri chalala. Because we'll say, the Gemara essentially answers, you're mixing and matching two different things. The Mishnah, our Mishnah, was talking about when she becomes a chalala. In other words, I will say, if a woman is in a legal relationship with a Kohen, that could render her a chalala, which would preclude her from marrying future Kohanim. Everyone agrees that a woman only becomes a chalala when? After biyah. So the Gemara says, Ki kami boili, Our question is, V'hu isha bivsuleha yikach. We're asking a very specific question, which is, the pasuk says that a Kohen Gadol has to marry a besula. So it says yikach, he shall take her. We're trying to figure out at what point in time does she need to be a besula. So the Gemara says, my kicha. So the Gemara says, who isha yikach, my kicha de kiddushin ba'inon, or kicha de nisuin ba'inon. We're asking a different question, says the Gemara. Which kicha, which taking are we referring to? Are we referring to ultimately, again, the kicha of kiddushin, right? Are we saying that the woman has to be a besula at the time of kiddushin, or does she have to be a quote-unquote complete besula at the time of nisuin? Amarlei hay nami tenisua. So the answer, the truth is, we learned this as well. Where did we learn this? Ires es ha'almana v'nismana lios kohen gadol. Let's say a very interesting question. Or interesting case, I should say. Let's see, you have a stam coin, right? And a regular coin, we know, is permitted to go ahead and marry an almana, right? He's permitted to marry an almana. And then what happens? Halacha l'maisa. So he's permitted to marry an almana, and then he becomes appointed as the Kohen Gadol. Comes appointed as the Kohen Gadol. So an interesting case. So he did erisin with the almana, and then becomes appointed as the Kohen Gadol. So we'll say, so again, just to be clear, he hasn't done nisuin with this woman yet. So erisin with the almana, totally permitted. He's a regular Kohen. Then he's elected to the office of the Kahuna Gedola, Mazel Tov. What's the shaila? Is he allowed to go ahead and do nisuin with this almana? So erisin was beheter. Erisin was totally beheter. Right now, the shaila is, can he do nisuin with this almana now that he's the Kohen Gadol? To which the Gemara says, yes. Iris es almana v'nismana lios Kohen Gadol yichnos. Incredible halacha. Absolutely incredible halacha. So even though, again, now doing nisuin, he's already the Kohen Gadol, nevertheless, halacha l'maisa, he is permitted to marry her. The Rebbe say, now what do you see from there? What do you see from that case? That the halachic validity of marriage is established when? At the time of erisin. See, essentially what we're saying in that case is like this. Kohen, when you did erisin with this woman, was it a permitted relationship? And the answer over here, of course, is yes. Yes, he was a regular Kohen who did erisin with an almana. Now you're the Kohen Gadol, and nisuin, it would be prohibited. We don't worry about nisuin. In other words, when we judge the halachic validity of a marriage, what we look at is the time of erisin. It will say absolutely incredible. To which the Gemara says, no, it's not a good proof. I'll tell you why. Shani hasam kirichsev yikach isha. I will say the pasuk says, it's actually very interesting. So the pasuk the Gemara is quoting is Amona ugrusha v'chalala zona as ela lo yikach ki em besula me'amav yikach isha. So I will say, listen to this. So the pasuk says yikach isha. This is actually talking about the obligation for the Kohen Gadol to marry a besula. So look at Rashi for just a moment. Shani hasam tichsev isha. Rashi says it's the first of the short lines. Kim besula me'amav yikach isha. V'hai isha kra yiseruhu. And I will say that isha is extra. In other words, the pasuk could have just read amana ugrusha v'chalala zona es ela lo yikach. Right? Kohen Gadol can't marry an amana, a grusha, chalala, a zona. Ki im besula me'amav. He has to marry besula. Yikach isha, that phrase, yikach isha, he shall take a wife, is extra. So says the Gemara, there's a drasha. What's the drasha? Back to Rashi. We're going to see later on, de'im ires almana v'nismana lios Kohen Gadol yichnos. So we're going to see later on that the Gemara is going to use that phrase, yikach isha, to teach us this halacha, that if a Kohen Gadol does if a regular Kohen does erisin with an almana, totally permitted marriage, and then during erisin, he's appointed as the Kohen Gadol, he's permitted to go ahead and marry her. From the extra phrase, yikach isha, to which the Gemara says, and it's all shiny us in the city, yikach isha. To which the Gemara says, so therefore you can't bring a raya from that case. Why can't you bring a raya? Because it's a drasha. It's a drasha. So therefore, I will say, in other words, you can't bring a raya from this particular case, that therefore, halacha lamaisa, we determine the halachic validity of marriage at the moment of erisin. Since it's quite possible that perhaps this case is different because you have a pasuk that supports it. I says the Gemara hachanamik siv isha. So the Gemara says I, but it says isha over here also. To which the Gemara says achaz v'lo shtayim. No. We'll say you could only make right one drasha from isha and not two. I say, how do you know which drasha to make? So the Gemara says uma rois. How do you know that the drasha comes to teach me this particular case of the Kohen Gadol, of the Kohen who did Erusin with the Almana, and maybe not the case of Bogeres? To which the Gemara says very simply, ha ishtani gufa, ha lo ishtani gufa. I will say, if you think about it, by the way, there is a fundamental difference. Remember, we're dealing now with two cases which we're trying to compare. Case number one is what we started with this morning, where, again, a Kohen, right, or a Kohen Gadol, did Erusin with a Nara, okay? She becomes a Bogeres now before Nisuin. As we're going to see in the next sugya, it's possible that when a girl becomes a Bogeres, she doesn't satisfy the criteria of Besula for Kohen Gadol. So now the shaila is he permitted to do Nisuin with her? Erusin was permitted, Nisuin, that's the shaila. We tried to compare it to this case of a Kohen, regular Kohen, who does Erusin with an Almana, totally permitted. Now, he's appointed to the office of the Kahuna Gidola, and yet the halacha is that what? He is permitted to go ahead and do Nisuin with her. She's an Almana, and he's a Kohen Gadol, to which the Gemara says, we originally thought, what do you see from here? You see from here that halachic validity of marriage is determined at the time of Erusin. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not what's happening here. You know what's happening in the case of a Kohen who does Erusin with an Almana, then becomes Kohen Gadol, he's permitted to do Nisuin. You know what's happening over there? A drasha. You have a phrase, the Yikach Isha, that's coming to include an additional case, Yikach Isha, this woman who he was permitted to do Erusin with. Now he becomes the Kohen Gadol. Technically, Kohen Gadol can't have an Almana, but since he did Erusin, he's permitted to go ahead and take her as a wife. We'll see that full drasha. But the Gemara says it doesn't teach me anything about Bogeres. To which the Gemara says, but if it works for the case of Erusin with an Almana, why wouldn't it work for the case of Erusin with a Nara who becomes a Bogeres? To which the Gemara says there's a very simple distinction between the two cases. In the case of Nara who becomes a Bogeres, she has undergone a physical change. In the case of the Almana, there is no change vis-a-vis the woman. The woman is the same. The Rebbe says that's the end of the sugya. Just I'll point out to you, interestingly enough, the Rambam Paskins, we're gonna come back to the Bogeres case. That's gonna be our next sugya. So we'll see the halacha lamaisa there. But what I will tell you, interestingly enough, is the Rambam Paskins like this statement that we just saw over here, which is that if you have a Kohen who did Erusin with an Almana, right, totally permitted, because a regular Kohen is permitted to marry a widow. So a regular Kohen does Erusin with an Almana. During Erusin, the Kohen is appointed as the Kohen Gadol. He is permitted to do Nisuin with this woman, which I will say is incredible. So in other words, you could have a situation where you could be attending the chasana of a Kohen Gadol to an Almana. You'll say impossible. Not impossible. How could it happen? When he did Erusin with her when he was a regular Kohen. And that in fact is how the Rambam Paskins, but again I will say, it's not really based on Svara, it's not a logic, it's based on the drasha of the pasuk, the extra phrase, Yikach Isha. Incredible. Let's go back to Mishnah. Says the Mishnah. Kohen Gadol Yisamar. So now actually we're going to get into the sugya of Kohen Gadol. Who is the Kohen Gadol permitted to marry, not permitted to marry? So Kohen Gadol Yisa Almana, Bein Almana Min Erusin and Bein Almana Min Nesun. A Kohen Gadol can't marry a widow, and any kind of widow. He can't marry a widow from Erusin, can't marry an Almana from Nisuin. V'lo Yisa Sabogeres. So we'll say here it is. A Kohen Gadol also can't marry a Bogeres. Now again, we're going to see the logic of not. So remember, just to define our terms: Ketana, a girl below the age of 12; Nara, a very short window, a 6-month window, 12 to 12 and a half to 12 years old in 6 months. Bogeres is essentially a Gedola, a girl above the age of 12 years old and 6 months. So the Gemara says a Kohen Gadol should not marry a Bogeres. And I will say there's an interesting machlokes here. We'll see this later on. So who should he marry? Are we saying that he should marry either a Ketana or a Na'ara? Or perhaps we're going to see there's a school of thought that says he should dafka marry a Na'ara. Again, we'll get into that. In any event, the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Machshir Bogeres. Rabbi Shimon is saying, no, he's allowed to marry Bogeres. He's allowed to marry a Bogeres. We'll see the nature of that machlokes. V'lo yisa es mukas eitz. And I will say this is actually an interesting case. Mukas eitz is a woman who does not have besulim. So the hymen has been ruptured, but not through an act of bia, not through an act of relations. Mukas eitz means some type of injury. And by the way, we're going to see mukas eitz doesn't have to be like traumatic injury. Mukas eitz could be just for some reason the besulim are not intact, but again, not a result of relations. So what's interesting about this is you have a situation of a woman who is a besula in that she has never had relations, but she doesn't have besulim. But the actual hymen itself is not intact. So the Mishnah says that a Kohen Gadol shouldn't marry a mukas eitz either. Okay, let's see. Says the Gemara Tanraban, Amona lo yikach, bein Amona ha'eres, bein Amona min ha'nisuim pshita. Which I'm actually very proud of myself, but causing some problems, I'm sure, for the rest of the chevra. In any event, okay, let's go later. So says the Gemara. I might have thought as follows. I might have thought like this. I would learn out Amona from Tamar. And I will say, now remember again, so the Gemara is over here talking about the story of Tamar, where remember Tamar's husbands died, 2 husbands died, Er and Onan. And remember, Yehuda says to Tamar, Shevi Almana Beis Avich. Literally, again, stay as an almana at your father's home. Stay an almana at your father's home. So remember again, in that particular situation, Tamar was an almana from Nisuin, right? From Nisuin. So I might have thought that when the Torah says that a Kohen Gadol can't marry an almana, I might have thought that it's dafka only an almana from Nisuin, but an almana from Erisin would have been okay. Malahalon min hanisuin, afka min hanisuin. Kamash malon, no. Kamash, the Mishnah teaches me that halacha l'maisa, Kohen Gadol is not permitted to marry any kind of almana, whether she is an almana from Erisin or an almana from Nisuin. To which the Gemara says, "Ve'ema hachinami." I don't understand. Maybe not. It's good drasha. Why not accept that drasha? Maybe the Kohen Gadol only can't marry an almana from Nisuin. To which the Gemara says, "Dumina de grusha, ma grusha bein min hanisuin bein ha'erisin af almana bein ha'erisin bein min hanisuin." So we'll say since almana and grusha are linked, so therefore just like grusha, it doesn't matter if she's divorced from Erisin or from Nisuin, the Kohen Gadol can't marry her. So too by almana, whether she is widowed from Erisin or from Nisuin, Kohen Gadol can't marry her. Incredible. But let's go back to V'lo yisas habogeres. He's not permitted to marry the bogeres. So we'll say this is going to be a very interesting sugya. So why not? In other words, we'll say, remember, the bogeres in question over here, it's not like she's been married, right? There's no previous relationship. So why halacha l'maisa can't the Kohen Gadol marry a bogeres? So listen to this. Tan Rabbanon, v'hu isha bivsu leha yikach. So we'll say the pasuk that refers to a Kohen Gadol's obligation to marry a besula is interestingly worded. V'hi isha bivsu leha. He should marry a woman who isha bivsu leha in her besulim, in her bivsu leha, almost like in her besula state. So what? Listen to this. Prat lebogeres shakalala besulaha. Dear Rabbi Meir, so we'll say Rabbi Meir says bivsulaha teaches me that her besulim must be fully intact. As I mentioned when we started the shir today, because the Gemara already alluded to this on the bottom of Menchesa and Beis, which is there's a concept in halakha. Rabbi Meir feels that as a woman gets older and becomes more active, even the besulim themselves thin out. And therefore, again, when the Torah says, V'hu isha bivsuleha yikach, the Torah is telling me that the Kohen Gadol must marry a woman whose bisulim are fully intact bisulim. And by definition, a bogeres does not have fully intact bisulim. Rabbi Rebbe Shimon said, no, Kohen Gadol can marry bogeres, totally fine. So the Ma'akim Miflagi, what are they arguing about? So here we go. Rabbi Meir Savar, Bisula afilu miktsas bisulim mashma. Rabbi Meir says like this. When the pasuk says bisuleha or bisulim, right, or bisula I should say, bisula means a woman who's a bisula. Whether you have all of the bisulim, some of the bisulim, as long as you have some element of the bisulim, it is absolutely okay and permitted. Halacha l'maisa, Kohen Gadol is permitted to go ahead and marry her. So the Gemara says, bisuleha adiika kol ha-bisulim. Now both saying, here's what's interesting. Rabbi Meir is darshaning as follows. Here's the issue. As I mentioned before, the Torah writes this word in a strange way. Bivsuleha. So essentially what we're going to see is that Rabbi Meir essentially says you have to break down this word into multiple drashas. So the first thing we darshan is bisula. Had it just said bisula would teach me that as long as there is some part of the bisulim intact, that would be fine. That would be fine, right? Bisuleha. But now that it says bisuleha means what? Adiika kala bisulim. You need all of the bisulim to remain intact. Now, both say, now remember, but it doesn't say bisula and it doesn't say bisuleha. Instead, what does it say? Bivsuleha. So both say, this is incredible. This is like the mother of drashas. What you have over here are essentially three drashas in one. So bisula teaches me that I would have thought some bisulim are okay. Bisuleha, all of the bisulim need to be intact, which is why, according to Rabbi Meir, he cannot marry a bogeres. Bivsuleha teaches me what? Bikedarka in, shelo kedarka lo. Bivsuleha both teaches me that halacha l'maisa, the only thing that's problematic is bia kidarka. Bia shelo kidarka is not a problem. In other words, that a woman only loses her bisulim through bia kidarka, but not bia shelo kidarka. Look at Rashi, bivsuleha, beis yesera demashma hachi lemedrash b'makom bisuleha. So what's interesting is as follows. So he darshans is like this. The last piece, bivsuleha, in her bisulim, indicates to us that it is only bia in the makom bisulim, only bia in the place where the bisulim are that renders her a non-bisula. But bia shelo kidarka, which obviously takes place not in the makom bisulim, does not render her a non-bisula. This is the shita of Rabbi Meir. As the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon hold bisula shlema mashma. So we'll say they have an opposite drasha. When it just says bisula means a complete bisula. Bisuleha, the word bisuleha teaches me, afilu miktsas bisulim, even if some of the bisulim are left. So even a bogeres who may have thinned out bisulim, halacha l'maisa, still satisfies the criteria of bisula. Bivsuleha, what does that teach me? Achukol bisuleha kayamin, ben kedarka ben shelo kedarka. She has to be a complete bisula. And I will say, what does it mean to be a complete bisula? A basula from bia kedarka and a basula from bia shelo kedarka. So I will say, this is the fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar Shimon. I will say, we see, by the way, the machlokes is really in two areas, right? Number one is a Kohen Gadol permitted to marry a bogeres, or to say a little bit differently, is a bogeres considered to be a besula? According to Rabbi Meir, the answer is no. And the reason for that, according to Rabbi Meir, is because halacha l'maisa, the definition of besula is a woman whose besulim are fully intact. But a bogeres, just by definition, just by dint of age and activity, is going to have thinned out besulim, therefore she's not a besula. Rabbi Elazar B'Shimon, she is a besula. That's machlokes 1. Machlokes 2, Rabbi Osai. If a woman has had bia shelo kedarka, does that take away her besula status? Remember, so bia shelo kedarka, the besulim themselves are still intact, right? The hamin is still, the besulim are intact, but halacha l'maisa, she's experienced an act of bia. So again, Rabbi Meir will say she's still a besula. Rabbi Elazar Shimon will say she's not a besula. So two fundamental machloks, incredible. So it says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Nivala shelo kedarka, besula l'kahuna. If a woman has bia shelo kedarka, by definition, she is no longer a besula, and ultimately, again, psula likahuna. Psula kahuna. Now, Rashi points out, obviously, the Kohen Gadol, right? Remember, again, this is talking only a Kohen Gadol has an obligation to go ahead and marry a besula. Other Kohanim do not have this obligation. So the Gemara is introducing over here, Rav says the name of Rav, that bia shelo kedarka takes away her besula status. So it says, massive Rava raises a kasha, Velosi Isha. So we'll say it's actually very interesting. This is talking about over here that if a man who goes ahead and violates or seduces a woman, the halacha is he's obligated to marry her. He's obligated to marry her. Velosi Isha, he has to marry this woman. To which the Gemara says, the Isha haru'iyalo. Now this is interesting. He's only permitted to marry her if it's a legal marriage. Obviously, this guy's not so concerned with halacha to begin with, but lamaisa, the Torah is not going to allow him to marry someone who he's not allowed to marry. So, velosi isha, if she's someone who is permitted to marry, prat ala amana the kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza the kohen hedyot, to exclude a case of, let's say we're a man, let's say a kohen gadol went ahead and violated a woman, or I should say seduced a woman, and she was a grusha or a chalutza. I'm sorry, she was an almana, right, or a grusha v'chalutza for that matter. So which the Gemara says, well, let's analyze this. Hechi dami, what would be the case if already had relations with her? If ultimately again he had with her via kidarka, my area mishum almana, then what does it matter if she's an almana? Teifokle mishum dahavi beula. I will say there's another reason why the kohen gadol wouldn't be able to, and not because of beula. So I will say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, that ultimately again via shelo kidarka is not a problem of besula. To which the Gemara says, Mishum Amana in Mishum Be'ulalo. To which the Gemara will say, Amad Beis, Hamani Rabbi Meir. Whose opinion does this reflect? This is Rabbi Meir. This is Rabbi Meir. Both say, now what does Rabbi Meir say? Listen to this. So we'll say, remember again, look at Rashi. Hamani Rabbi Meir. Top Rashi in Nun Tesla Beis. The Amar Bisulaha Ad Shiyu Kol Bisulaha Kayamin. Prat Labogeres Vayasur Labisula Liminute Beula Shelo Kedarka Deshayu. Okay, so this reflects the view of Rabbi Meir. So we already saw that. Remember again, there's 2 points of machlokes over here. Point of machlokes, the one is a kohen gadol permitted to marry a bogeres, and point number 2 of machlokes, does bia shelo kedarka take away besula status? So obviously this is reflecting the view of Rabbi Meir that bia shelo kedarka does not remove besula status. The Rav Damar Rabbi Elazar, but Rav holds like Rabbi Elazar, to which the Gemara says, 1 second, Ik Rabbi Elazar, my area mishum beula, seifok leida havila zona. We'll say 1 second, if we're going according to Rabbi Elazar, then don't worry about beula over here. There's a different issue of zona. Now we'll say, this goes back to the sugya we had 2 days ago. Remember, classically, we think of zona as a woman who has engaged in an illicit relationship. But as we've seen through this sugya, the real definition of zona doesn't have to be quote-unquote illicit. In other words, it's illicit, but it could be zona by definition is any relationship with a man with whom a woman cannot affect kiddushin. That's really what it means over here. If she can't affect kiddushin, then halacha l'maisa, that makes her a zona. So this case over here says the Gemara according to Rabbi Elazar, if a kohen gadol is violating an almana, let's say he's seducing an almana, or a kohen hedyot is seducing a grusha or chalutza, these are situations where kiddushin is impossible. And if kiddushin is impossible, then halacha l'maisa, bia with one of these women should create a zona situation. Rabbi Elazar, to which the Gemara says, I'm going to say 3rd line down in Testament base 59b, to which the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar, Panoi habala pnui shaloshem ishos asa zona. Right? Rabbi Elazar says, I will say, listen to this. He goes even a step further. He says that even if a single man and a single woman have relations, not for the sake of affecting marriage, so ultimately again they just have relations with no intention for ishos, ultimately again, she becomes a zona. To which the Gemara said, well, say now again, that's a different, we happen not to paskin that way. We hold that halacha l'maaseh for a woman to be called a zona, it has to be a relationship in which kiddushin would be ineffective, where there would be no kiddushin. So if you have a single man and a single woman who have relations, then halacha l'maaseh, again, it's illegal, but it doesn't make her a halachic zona. So I'll say, some of you will say, so just to be clear, we're trying to figure out over here as follows. Remember again, here's what we're trying to figure out. The Gemara said over here, just to follow the progression, Rav said that Bia Shelo Kedarka ultimately again makes a woman psula likahuna. Okay, that's what's happening over here, right? So meaning, essentially, Bia Shelo Kedarka removes the basula status of a woman. Okay, we then went from there. Rava raised the kasha, right? And Rava said, reality, the Gemara says, the hasa mishum ba'ulaika mishum zonaleka. This is actually quite fascinating. In the case of bestiality, the Gemara says that all you would have is a situation of ba'ula and not zona. Then I will say, now why is that? In bestiality, the halacha would be as follows. She's obviously no longer a basula, because again, the basulam are not there, but she wouldn't be a zona. The reason she wouldn't be a zona is because the status of zona is only in a halachically recognized act of relations. But in bestiality, it is not a halachically recognized act of relations. So I will say, so therefore, you would have a woman who is not a besula, she's not a besula, but she's not a zona either. I'm really Abai says one second, I don't understand that. If she's a bu'ula, she should be a zona. V'izona lo havya, bu'ula nami lo havya. And if she's not a zona, right, then ultimately she shouldn't be a bu'ula. V'chi tema midi dahavya mukas eitz shelo kidarko. I will say maybe it should be no different than the case of a mukas eitz, right? Mukas eitz shelo kidarko. So I will say, so for example, you can have a situation of, right, let's say again, we'll say the case of mukas eitz shelo kidarko would mean, let's say again, there was some level of penetration shelo kidarko, but not as a result ultimately again of bia, but a result ultimately of something else, to which the Gemara says, it's actually very interesting. They'll say, if there's such a case of, so listen to how fascinating this is, if there's such a case of mukas eitz shelo kidarko, Imkain im lecha isha sheksher lekahuna shelo nasis mukas eitz ayedei tzrar. We'll say this is pretty wild. If there's such a concept of mukas eitz shelo kidarka, then there is no woman in the world who is kshera to marry a kohen. And I will say a little bit of background to this. This brings us back to our Gemara in Maseches Brachos that we saw for the first time, where in Talmudic times they used to wipe with stones. So I will say, when you're wiping with stones, don't try it, but Lamaisa, we've heard, when you're wiping with stones, right? So again, some level of penetration by definition occurs. So if there's a concept of mukas eitz shelo kidarka, then halacha lamaisa, essentially, you go ahead and preclude any woman from going ahead and marrying a kohen gadol. Therefore, that can't be the case. B'mima enes. Therefore, I will say must be that the case of Rav is found in a case of Mima Enes. Take a look at Rashi, a quick look at Rashi, right across. Allah Amar Vizera, Mashkachas lo lahad dirav alibud revelazar dahavya bu'ula velozor. So we'll say we're talking about a very simple case. Nothing here is simple today, but we're talking about a case where we're looking for a situation where a woman could be a bu'ula, but not a zona. Bu'ula, but not zona. What's the case of where it's bu'ula and not the zona? Mima enes. Now I will say, take a look at, go back to Rashi for just a moment. Just looking for a case of bu'ula that's not a zona. Listen to this. We're talking about a girl who was married off as a minor. And we're talking about a situation where halacha l'maisa, she was married off not by her father, but by her mother or her brother. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, all we have is kiddushay dirabanan. Her husband had relations with her only shelo kidarka umiyana bo. Miyana bo means that halacha l'maisa, she does miyun. Remember, I'm supposed to say, so a lot of stuff going on over here. She's a kitana, who was married off by her mother or her brother, Kiddushay Kitana, right? But Dirabanan, remember, in that type of marriage, how do you dissolve it? You could dissolve it simply through miyun, through refusal. He only had bia with her, bia shelo kidarko, and therefore halacha lamaisa. That's a case, says the Gemara, that there's no znus, l'val ba'alo shelo kidarko miyanabo de'in kan psul znus va'almanas v'gerushin. In this case, ultimately, again, there's no znus because she was married, right? There's no almanas and gerushin because remember, again, what does miyun do? Miyun fundamentally uproots the marriage. And I will say, what do we learn from here? Rashi, and therefore I will say this would be a case where although she is not the grusha, she's not an almana, ultimately again, but she is a ba'ula. She is a ba'ula. Why is she a ba'ula? Because she had bia shelo kedarka. And that would be the proof of the Gemara you see from here that halacha lamaisa, bia shelo kedarka makes a woman into, Gemara says, nibala lemi she'eno ish. If a woman has relations with a person who's not an ish, now what's a person who's not an ish? An animal, bestiality. Afapisha beskilo, even though ultimately she's punishable by skilo, ksher l'kuhuna. So this is fascinating, right? The act of bestiality is a capital crime, punishable by death. Even though halacha l'maisa, her act is punishable by death, nevertheless she is kshera l'kuhuna. She's kshera l'kuhuna. And I will say, now what's the logic? So the Gemara says, because halacha l'maisa, this allows her to go ahead and halacha l'maisa, right, she's ksher l'kuhuna because she's a mukas 8. So I will say, now I want to be clear. Whether or not a mukas 8 is permitted to marry a kohen is in and of itself a machlokes, right? That's the machlokes. According to the opinion who says that a mukas 8 is permitted to marry a kohen gadol, she would be permitted as well. Kes Rav Dimi Amar, listen to this. Ma'aseh beriva achos. Well, this is a pretty wild Gemara. Ma'aseh beriva achos behislo. There was one time a young girl in the city of Hislo who was sweeping the floor. And she was sodomized by a dog. Okay? By a dog. And Rebbe permitted her to marry a kohen gadol. And I both say, so again, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa bia shelo kedarko ultimately again does not take away her besula status. It essentially does it right. Amar Shmuel kohen gadol me Rebbe. Amar Shmuel kohen gadol be me Rebbe kohen gadol mi hava. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Rebbe allowed her to marry kohen gadol. It will say Rebbe lived long after the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Look at Rashi. Rebbe la'achar churban abayis haya. Rebbe lived after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Kamadoros shusof hatanoim oben Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai charav abayis. So what do you mean Rebbe allowed her to marry a kohen gadol? Rebbe was living long after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. To which the Gemara says, "Elo ru'uya kohen gadol." Rather, again, halacha l'maisa, she was permitted to marry a kohen gadol. So we'll say the idea over here is Rebbe was saying, had there been a kohen gadol, halacha l'maisa, she would have been permitted to marry the kohen gadol. We'll say again, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, at least according to Rebbe, bia shelo kedarka does not take away her besula status. So Rabbi say what you begin to see, and this goes back to what we just said, what we said in the beginning of this sugya. There are two fundamental machloksim. Well, actually, three fundamental machloksim. Machlokis number 1, could a kohen gadol marry a bogeres or not? That's machlokis 1. Machlokis 2, could a kohen gadol marry mukas 8s or not? That we haven't really gotten into. And machlokis 3, and they're all connected. Can a kohen gadol marry a woman who is physiologically a besula, but has had bia shelo kedarka? Does bia shelo kedarka remove besula status or not? Amalei Rava mi Pirkei Ravashi mina hamilsa da Amar Rabbanan was the interesting idea. Where is this concept that the Rabbanan say? Let's at least begin this. Ein znus lebehema. Rava say that there's no zunos for a behema, which means Rava say that ultimately, as we said before, that if a person engages in an act of bestiality, and remember this has a greater ramification for a woman than a man, if she engages in an act of bestiality, halacha l'maisa, it's illegal and it's a capital crime for both men and women, But halacha l'maisa, it does not go ahead and, so to speak, count as a typical act of znus. So, for example, she'd still be permitted, according to what we said before, to marry a kohen, or kohen gadol, I should say. T'chsev lo savi esnan zona u'mechir kelev. So we'll say the pasuk says, "You shall not bring." Now we'll say this is talking about over here the halacha that says that a person is not permitted to go ahead and bring an esnan zona u'mechir kelev. We'll say, I'll